if you could you introduce EA and give the everybody an opportunity to understand the practice of emergency effective arts?
Yes. Well, I suppose I would start off by talking about my own journey. I went to Dartington College of Arts, which at the time was an interesting experimental place to be. I had no idea what it was about, but I went there and discovered that it wasn't about making work that was on the stage, it wasn't about working in a very traditional sense of classical ballet, which was probably where I came from. It was about working in lots of different contexts. So I found myself in my first year working in a psychiatric ward and using the arts to engage people who were generally under the liquid cosh. But that was a way of finding a context for the skills that I was being taught by the lecturers there. And I also found myself out doing Threepenny Opera to the local Navy base, which was quite a challenge. So I suddenly started to see that the arts weren't where I thought they were always going to be, which was in the theatre and the art gallery. And got a taste for that, and then was very influenced by a company called Welfare State International, who at the time were nomadic and travelling around Devon and other places. Dartington's in Devon, was in Devon. I come from London, so obviously from all of that I went back into my urban environment and tried to find ways in which I could engage with different spaces again. I found myself in a community centre surrounded by a very new housing estate. So the focus of my work then switched to how I could work in that place with those people. And it was the idea that I could take whatever art form was interesting to me and the other artists and the collective that we started there, and that we could use that in the context of a community that was living and working around us, and how we could actually engage them, often actually in exchange for using the space inside the community centre to hone our skills and to develop our work. It was a kind of reciprocal arrangement, really, of how do we bring this local community together and use this community centre as our practice space.
Why has this one company actually been so effective, do you think, in relation to your own experience?
Well, I suppose it's quite dynastic as well, in that it's, it was handed on to companies like mine, and Plank was another company that came about 15 years after us, and then there was other companies all around, mostly north of England, so we were the only ones down south for a long time. In Brighton there was Same Sky, I don't think you know that. And we were all very influenced by Welfare State because they ran things like summer schools when we'd go and camp in some very wet field in Cumbria and work with their artists. And those artists became our artists, and this tribe of artists that this has gone on ever since. A kind of feeling that we're all part of the same tribe, the same family, and we know each other's kids who are now doing it, and so this dynastic thing has happened where there's been this constant exchange over the decades.
Although not as bad as perhaps, and I'm saying this kind of provocatively, as some agitprop organisations at the time, but there is something about the agitprop movement that absolutely did break a mould in relation to theatre. Bright colours, loud messages, clarity, brilliance of message, etc., which people have adopted without necessarily holding on to the directness of it. What do you think?
Well, I think some of that directness remained with us for a while because emergent sex arts emerged at the same time that Margaret Thatcher did, and there was a very strong feeling, anti-Thatcherite feeling amongst this fraternity, this tribe of artists. So there was some very direct messaging during that time, supported somewhat by what was then called the GLC, the Greater London Council, where Ken Livingstone was the leading politician there, who actually funded us to do things like build Thatcher effigies and so on. So this is the early stages of working with that community. I was talking about around the community centre and creating, engaging kids, anybody who'd want to join in really, and tell mythical stories inspired by different traditions, sort of British traditions really at the time. Wanting to build things big and then burn it down. Sort of company of arsonists, I suppose. We were angry, then we start to sort of get into this idea of protest and using our art to enhance protest. So, Ride of the Apocalypse there. This horseman was built by a man called Julian Crouch from Probable Theatre originally. He was just a volunteer at the time, but he built this, and this went to lots and lots of CND marches, anti-apartheid marches. There was a great, I say it in a kind of whimsical way, a great time for protests, but actually there were some very strong issues that we felt we should be claiming. And this is about different legislations. This is about the Social Security Bill. We created a crazy golf game to knock down the people who were claiming benefits, which was the idea of taking the benefits away from people. The previous piece of work was a touring Christmas grotto that went to the miners, the striking miners. Inside that we built an alternative Hansel and Gretel story with a witch, with the next one, who again had a slightly chubby Thatcher look. We took this to the miners that were striking, took it to Greenham Common, and this was a way of kind of giving people some support, joy in their lives.
How did young people who were very used to the cliched idea about Christmas and gossip, how did they connect up?
They thought it was hilarious, particularly she farted a lot, but that was very...
I'm sure that's all kids. Yeah.
Yeah. We were just finding ways in which we could engage with people who were kind of outside of the normal audience for the arts, really. And that was really what drove us, was to make work where art was as accessible as education and healthcare, but it was for everybody. And using this particular art form to make very specific, as you call it, agitprop messages.
It's funny because I'm using it like as if it's a derogatory term, because it has been taken up as a derogatory term. It's like it lacks a sophistication. But then I'm kind of interested about what happens in '68. I'm happy that you get this more professionalised art form, which seems to be more sophisticated in its levels of understanding, but perhaps at the same time loses something quite powerful in the engagement, and definitely in the community engagement of participation, which strangely now is coming back into funding.
Isn't it?
Arts
Just, yeah.
Community, which was like put outside as being sort of the bad dog, is now being invited back in the game under the term participation. Okay, there's issues under that, big issues in relation to what that might mean, in relation to the Arts Council, in relation to the decline in funding, the need to be sustainable, the need to engage with different communities to stay solvent. But there's something also quite interesting about it as well, which is
but it's gone in phases and waves. This idea that the ordinary person can also be creative and artistic and so on.
Fuse basically works within Somerset, which is not a very kind of minus strike country. It has been very culturally undiverse. It's a place where Jacob Reeves Moggs sells out in terms of various talks when he puts them on, etc. But when we were invited to go into a community where they had just spent £1 million and wasted it in an area of high social deprivation, we said we're here to stay. We're not going away, we're here to stay. Most arts organisations, and the way that arts funding is structured often is you fly in, you try and leave some impact, and then you fly out, and people become deeply cynical very quickly. Oh, here we go again. So that sense of engaging with the community and going through the ups and downs of those communities has actually led to a really interesting multi-stranded project which embraces community, embraces festival, embraces emerging young artists, which has similarity to what you're going to be talking about, I think, as well, and in relation to what I call transdisciplinary objectives, which go beyond interdisciplinary, look at bigger themes that might be with the environment. So we're working with the Quantox, which is a particular hill range in Somerset, etc. And this all started by just staying in one community and it growing as being a very exciting project.
And that's certainly what they did, was they were very rooted in that community. They did all their wonderful trips to Japan and Toronto and various places, but there was always this ongoing programme of work in Barrow and Finesse, which is a very industrial town on the edge of the Lake District. And we did the same. So, you know, we started off being in that housing estate in Woolwich, in South East London, and then we eventually settled just a bit further up the road in an old church building, which we've been in since '87, and have always been working in the various kind of neighbourhoods around us, whilst we are also, I suppose, being like the circus that blows into town in other cities and other towns. But my proviso with everybody that ever commissions us is that we work with local artists and local communities who are then going to have to take some of that forward. It's not ideal, and it's very hard to sustain anything with the way funding works. You seldom get enough money to do more than one project, but sometimes you'll get enough money to work for 3 years. But nevertheless, I think it's important sometimes to go somewhere to show what's possible, and then build on that from within.
You're a national portfolio organisation, aren't you?
We are, yes.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting because that sets up a sort of structure for you that gives you some continuity and
yes, it's
but
about,
has any drawbacks?
no, it doesn't really. It's a good cushion. It's about 13% of our annual turnover. So we do a lot of work. We do about 70 projects a year. We're not like many arts organisations that have a set programme. We don't know necessarily what we're doing from year to year. We are opportunistic, don't mind saying that. We go where there's something interesting, exciting, and somebody's got some money to pay us to do it. It's very important, otherwise we wouldn't have lasted 39 years.
Yeah.
But you know, there's all sorts of agendas behind that, and they've switched. They've been very different agendas over periods of time, and then it comes round again. So regeneration has been very key to that. Regenerating communities, regenerating spaces, creating public artworks, creating events, and so on. And now it's property developers that want to work with us. That throws up all sorts of other agendas. But with local authorities now having less and less resources, being completely squeezed, they're losing most of their arts funding. It's Section 106 money that's paying for culture.
What is Section 106?
Section 106, it's probably called something different now, but it's basically all developers have to pay into the local authority money that's for social good.
5% of what they use in their budget or whatever it might be.
Yeah, it's a percentage.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And often that's used for community-focused work or culture or arts work.
So in Somerset, for example, they're building Hinkley Point. EDF, who have a large amount of money for reducing the conflict in the community. We have to look at it and think, wow, or no.
It's all about winning hearts and minds and trying to educate those people just as much as anybody else really is, to work with those developers and make them think a little bit more about how they're treating those communities, the kind of loss that people feel quite often because they're not engaged and they're not being able to use these wonderful new spaces because they're private. So it's that idea that perhaps we can work with the developers to ensure that there's access to beautiful newly built spaces for everybody. That's happened around King's Cross to a certain extent.
And was it Carl Lavery that basically, when they cleared out a part of the east end of London, he collected all the various voices, I can't remember what it was, of the community. He then put them into the posts because it was a motorway was being built. He found those voices. He installed them in a pillar that held up the motorway, and people hear those memories of those voices in that community. I think it's Lavery that did that. So, poetic, romantic, what, I don't know. Does it impact? Does it mean anything? What does it do as a community?
Well, if they're still there, they've not been basically shut down
Which is a lot
into the edge of the city.
So, poetry response.
Yeah, we did something in Glasgow once where it was when they were redeveloping it, the centre of the city. It was about to become the city of culture, and we were asked to work there. We did two big events. One was in what was the defunct shipyard, where we did a sort of ritual, I suppose, a ritual of getting rid of things. So this was an earlier version of it, where we created a large structure that was actually a sound piece. So all the things on this structure made a sound. There was an enormous skip, rubbish skip, which became a kind of percussive instrument with people bouncing up and down on bungees inside it and thumping it. And eventually, in this one, it was a car that was winched all the way to the top. This sense of expectation, was it going to fall or not? And it ended up in the skip. People thought there was somebody in it, but they nipped out quickly. So we did the same thing in Govan with a boat. So it was a boat that plummeted into the bin. This was a sort of statement of the local people feeling that they had been discarded. And then we also did a big parade in the middle of Glasgow where we worked with all those people who'd been put into the big town blocks on the edge of the city from the inner city, and we reclaimed the squares, the big public squares in the middle of the city, and had a huge party where every parcel was full of the people who'd come back into the city to say it's our square as much as it's the tourists' space as well. So it was pretty, it was fun. They had the biggest ice cream in the world in it, and giant parcels with bagpipers in them and sandbags, but it was about them being there and being, I suppose, being given permission to be there as well. So, I just wanted to show you another beginning of a kind of activist idea. And this was working with Greenpeace for many years to make protests about specific issues very visible and staging these large events. We did one at the British Nuclear Fuels where everybody was dressed up as plutonium barrels and missiles, and they cut their way through the fences and ran towards the process plant. And this was televised with the police chasing these people with plutonium barrels running across the field. And the next one we did was about the dredging of the North Sea for fish oils in order to make products, including biscuits. So we did this kind of fish tea and McFishy's tea, and dressed everybody up as puffins because we were puffins. It was about biodiversity and the compromising of the biodiversity of the North Sea. And this did have a great effect because International Biscuits, or whoever it was that owned the Pittings, stopped using fish holes. So doing these kind of very visual, performative moments that catch people. So now, of course, this would be done through the internet, but then it was a physical piece of work.
In Slovenia, there's a company called LUD, LJUD, that the president of Slovenia at the time were mocking any opponents as being idiots. So they basically constructed a mask of the president like an idiot. They put the plan of it onto the internet. Everybody downloaded it, printed it, put it on, went into the streets. It was fairly instrumental in his decline, which was very quick soon thereafter. It can be, using the internet, just a simple idea, incredibly effective to make change, using community networks that pass it on down through the system.
That was our response to one of the many financial crises that have happened through our lifetime, and that was a big crash in the 18th, I think, so that's the stock exchange going up in flames. But it was a local authority, Lambeth, that commissioned us to do that, to make their November the 5th bonfire night the burning down of the stock exchange. So
And in Holcombe, where we're working with these kids who used to, on November the 5th, go out and burn cars, because that was the best thing to do, basically, but most fun. We had fire shows on November the 5th, and they all joined in on these incredible fire shows and transformed, the situation within that community. And that's not just, by the way, saying, and therefore solving the problems of the council, that is also saying, absolutely putting healing in between generations that have felt absolutely ashamed of living in these communities and what was happening, the older generation, who then began to see the benefits of what young people could, and then pride in came into the place. And again, it's a controversial subject. What changes? Well, a lot changes actually in relation to people's lives.
So I've called these a series of experiments, but they're just kind of, through the decades, what's been the focus, and some of them have remained with us. So I called this one Building Bridges, but this was a response, I suppose, to the migration question and the communities that live in London, and us responding to that. So this is where I suppose I'll start to talk about hybridisation, or cultural hybridisation, which I suppose can be called also, what's the word when you're stealing somebody else's
Appropriation.
Appropriation. Yeah, we didn't see it that way. This was about collaboration, really. This was a collaboration between different artists who wanted to make a new form of music. I mean, it happens in music all the time. This is our street band called Crocodile Star. They met an Indian wedding band in London, and they learnt the repertoire of that Indian wedding band, and then started to explore the idea of Bollywood film and turning that into brass band music. So the Bollywood brass band was born out of our street band. And if you move on, we're surrounded where we are in Greenwich, and within Greenwich, and the people I've grown up with, and gradually become part of the company as well. So this was a response really to how we could create work in public spaces that represented everybody. So we started to work with classical Indian dancers, and working directly with people who wanted to create their own celebrations, but the traditional skills have disappeared within the community. So it's a bit like Coles to Newcastle. We're kind of teaching people how to create their own traditions, but making them very public and very obviously, everybody could actually enjoy these big events because they were for everybody in the community and not just for that particular group of people.
Yeah, and so just as an equivalent, we in the West Country, on a much smaller scale, re-orchard areas as a community project of orchards that have been destroyed within urban spaces, and that absolutely hits seasonal kind of feelings that people have within Somerset, because they still have that sense of the season being important. So we work on intergenerational projects again, where the older generation remembers when there are orchards in different parts of the city. And so that replanting becomes highly symbolic and a long-term idea of engagement with the communities they work in.
Well, this is with that was with the Hindu Community Association in North London, which is run mostly by a group of businessmen who probably never made a paper mache rather than for the Zero Festival before. But we worked with lots of young people there who helped us build it, that they could do it themselves next time. Just a big paper mache energy. Interestingly, it isn't just within the arts section of local authorities that we started to connect with. The housing officers called upon us to start working on a travellers' site, which is just down the road from where we are in Abbeywood. It's the largest travellers' site, gypsy travellers' site, mostly English Romany gypsies. And there was about 200 or 300 people lived on this site. It was in a pretty awful state actually when we were there. I suppose by bringing in outsiders, we were the outsiders to this place of outsiders, people who felt that they were outside of society as well. There started to be better connections. Because we lived on the site with them at various periods of time, the place got cleaned up. That's what it took. It took a bunch of outsiders to come in, and all the rubbish was cleared so that we could live next door to them. Because everything was fly tipped there. I mean, they had the dustmen wouldn't come on to the site, so everything was thrown into the field, and then everybody else from outside of the traveller's site used to throw the rubbish on there. So it was rat infested and nasty. But by us being there, it got cleaned up. But then we started to work with those people and learn a lot about their culture, and created pieces of work with them and for them and toured them. So horses and scrap metal became a sort of scrap metal horse, and creating stories around their experiences, creating our own community space there. And we did that for about 6 or 7 years and wrote a book about it so that people would learn more about travel culture. And the services were brought back on, adult education, literacy, all that sort of thing. I'm not saying we did all that, but it's just by bringing in a group of people who are prepared to respond to and work with and enjoy being with those people, then other people felt that they could do the same. And then we created a very successful piece of touring works. There's an elephant there, a metal elephant. We created a show called Runga, and for that show we started to think more about our own diversity as a company, as a group of artists. And there we were, living in London, and yet everybody working for us was white, British. And so by actually creating a piece of work with artists from those different backgrounds, so we work with Caribbean colonists, Indian dancers, and the Mela scene, yes, with people like Ajay Chhabra, who started the London Mela. We created a piece of work called Runga, which is sort of Hindi for Anisa, or the colour of colours actually, which I think is the poet. This became a sort of tour de force really of street arts, of performing arts on the street. There was dance, there were puppets, there were still walkers, it was a bit like a moving festival or a mela that went through the streets and then ended up in a space where there was a kind of finale spectacle. This was in 2003 through to 2000 and some later stage of the 2000s. We went to about 26 different towns and cities with it, which for a large scale piece was quite a big tour. And this is when we started to be knitted more into the Arts Council's agendas. And the Arts Council started to explore this idea of there being an arts sector called outdoor arts. Yeah. We were one of the sort of first wave of companies that were seen as a kind of ceremony.
And what sat in the middle of that was, of course, 2005, the Sultan's Elephant, which absolutely made them, And that was kind of interesting because it wasn't just a big elephant that comes to London, it was a big elephant that came right into Pall Mall that absolutely commented upon the actual post-imperial, post-colonial history of England and asked questions about identity, who are we, and what is this big empire that is signified by the Sultan's elephant, etc. So bigger conversations that went on in relation to that, and this extraordinary fact that it was a media event, a social media event, that 10,000 people turned up on the Friday, as you probably know the story, and they all started tweeting, basically, you've got to see this, and so by the time the Sunday had come, there was 1 million people that transformed from 10, and that's because their sense of ownership, or what they felt was ownership.
But they discovered something.
Yeah.
People would hear about it. There was hardly anybody there the first day, but it went on for 4 days.
Yeah.
But we had an elephant before they.
Hang on a minute.
That was a bit smaller. That had a profound effect on the sort of idea that this kind of work could be acknowledged as a bona fide area of arts practice, I suppose. And the knock-on effect for us with that was that we started a programme called It Can Happen Here, which was really about, well, yes, you can create this amazing spectacle of Pall Mall and Piccadilly, but actually you can do that in your town centre too. You can have that feeling that you're important just as much as everybody else thinks that. So It Can Happen Here has been the name really for our ongoing programme of outdoor arts activities that engage people and sometimes involve them, or sometimes we're creating it for them to mark a special moment in city's life. So this is all Runga, the first ever human Catherine wheel. Very proud of that. The guy who made it was the one that spins on it because well,
you thought of it, you do it.
You do it, yeah, exactly. But lots of people have done it since.
And that's kind of, it's a kind of important theme actually within outdoor arts. It is actually, as you probably know, much more like creation centres, production based.
Yeah.
In the absence of the illusion of theatre and all the buildings, then the making of it is incredibly important and engaging in the process. It's more, as you know, in France, they're more like factories that operate in order to create those kind of imaginations in the absence of backdrops and sightlines and on-off. There's this incredible kind of skills that are actually now embedded within the communities that operate. I don't know if you're interested, but there just has been a shed weekend up at the 101 Centre where you can go and be a shed person and start playing with objects and making stuff and sharing.
You see, Emergent Sector Arts is a big shed.
Okay.
Yeah, well, we've got a big yard at the back which is full of sheds. And we just acquired the tyre depot next door, which is an enormous shed. And it's just full of people who love to make contraptions. People who, as small children, took things apart and tried to find out how to put it all back together again.
And whilst there are specialists within outdoor arts, it's also an incredible kind of, you've got to do it yourself attitude towards working.
Yeah.
So since I've started doing it, I've actually become competent from being somebody who's completely incompetent in many different areas. And that's kind of wonderful impact and skill, which then gets passed on into community practices, etc. So that sense of self-enablement is an important aspect of this work, so that often parades are associated with community engagement, which go into sort of areas which does leave a very, very strong set of skill.
Yeah, so and I suppose anybody who walks into our building as an artist who may well be a practitioner in one art form is often asked to work in another one. So quite a lot of our makers end up as performers as well in the shows, like this guy, who's a car mechanic originally. Outdoor arts becoming a sector, becoming anything from projected spectacle, it's all video mapping now, this is done with slides on the castle, on Warwick Castle. creating a kind of concert vibe in a public park. Our puppets aren't willow anymore, they're sort of mechanical contraptions, using imagery for campaigns. This is a recycling campaign for a local authority, so this robot's made out of wheelie bins, and we've used this robot ever since for all sorts of things. There's something about being a company of long-standing, which is that we decided about 10 years ago to have our own kind of wing of younger people, younger artists, and some of that was done through the idea of which was tied in with the Olympics as well, which was about training young people up to be performers, outdoor arts practitioners, starting at quite an early age as an alternative to the youth theatre sort of programme really. But we also started to work more with 18 to 25-year-olds and how we could create the skills needed to be producers in the arts in general really. We weren't hiding it all off into our own way of working, but and we created a project called TOWIE, The Only Way is Ethics, which is obviously based on a popular TV programme. But we were working with Bishopsgate Institute, engaging a group of very diverse young people. Some perhaps had a bit of further education, some hadn't, and helping them to see how there was a future both in the arts and in the heritage industry, and using arts practice to make the heritage industry more popular, because lots of young people don't go to museums. They do when they're kids because the school takes them and the parents take them, but when you get into your teens, is that true, do you think? This is what we found anyway.
Which resonates with me in relation to running a street arts degree, or running a street arts degree for so long.
Yeah.
Where does this kind of education sit in terms of, can it sit in university? Does it sit somewhere between practice-based, practical practice-based? A university degree traditionally leads towards a kind of management status, where there isn't necessarily a clear management status within the street arts per se. Are you just training people to be producers? Is that it? Where's the making? This is not possible to build a making facility within a university very easily. We're not an art school, etc. So there were lots of problems and contradictions about trying to situate a degree which actually potentially was very academic in relation to the definition of place and site, and in relation to architecture, archaeology, architecture. Many subjects came into it, but by not being able to lock it down, in a way you feel this quite important gap for the 18 to 25-year-old, group
But may not be in university.
and may not want to go to university, may not want to travel through £9,000 a year to a place which is not guaranteed in any sense of being. Where do you deliver? And this is a subject for performing arts generally, as we know. But this particular moment is a key issue about what is it that we're trying to do. Anyway, I won't open that fish, but it's kind of relevant to what you're doing.
Yeah. So it's a sort of informal form of training and education, but very practically based, and inspired by collections and archives in museums. Let's talk about Paper Peace. As a response to the 1418 now commemorations of artistic commemorative events for World War I, we were invited to come up with an idea ourselves for that for 2018, and we decided to look at the idea of peace and what does peace feel like, and what was won from this momentous war. So we didn't actually get the funding for 1418 now, but we raised our own money from Arts Council England and Heritage Lottery Fund to launch the project last November, just the day after Armistice Day, with a peace poem or a peace statement. So artist Robert Montgomery, who kind of uses the context of public art almost as advertising, really, illuminated pieces of work or billboards and so on to make a statement. So 100 years and the dream never ends. And the idea is that we want to now take people on a journey for the whole of this year, including a group of young producers in the 4 cities, and work with them to create other artworks that respond to the idea of the profound impact of peacemaking and peace building, and researching that with the Peace Museum in Bradford, which I think is the only peace museum in this country, and looking at other ways in which people are building peace, important people who are heroes of peace and so on. And then November 2019, we will have 6 artworks created in those cities, and our giant poem, which toured to each of those cities in November, and make new work and events that are celebrating peace.
What we'd like to do, we've got other things we would like to talk about, of course, it's a massive subject, but there are certain companies that I think are really interesting, which I will put links into the publication. Companies like Tilted, for example, that use at the centre migration as being a kind of a key inspiration to interdisciplinary work, and Kamchatka, who work brilliantly in all sorts of different parts of the world, etc. And we will pitch those up as continuations and developments of artistic models and practices which are diverse and different from this, but in some way carry some of the inspiration within the centre of what they do. Thank you for coming, and thank you very much, Debs, for being here today.
Pleasure. Yeah, well, I hope it was changing.